Okay, this is our lecture on the evidence for evolution, the theory of evolution as proposed first by Darwin. So Darwin went on this voyage on the HMS Beagle, which stopped at the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands are off the coast of western South America. And what he noticed in his collections was that he found all these finches, right? They're called Darwin's finches, very famously known and referred to. And he collected 31 different ones from 3 different islands, and he noticed they all had different characteristics. And currently there are now 14 different species recognized. But what he hypothesized was that they all looked fairly similar, so they must have come from a common ancestor, and that they diverged from that common ancestor through the selection of the natural environment of the different environments within these islands. And he wrote that one might really fancy that one species has been taken and modified for different ends, which is the basis of his theory of evolution. Now, in order to have evolution, we have a few different conditions that have to be met. And modern research has verified Darwin's selection hypothesis, and these are the 3 different conditions. You have to have variation, so you have to have within a population a trait that has a variance within it. So for example, these giraffes have different arrangements in their color and spot patterns. 2, you must have reproductive success or fitness or some sort of selection event which allows one phenotype or a multiple range of phenotypes to be more successful than others. And finally, that variation, that phenotype which is successful, must be able to be passed on to others, and this is inherited through DNA. So there may be a selection event where you have this group of giraffes, but only the females only like the orangest ones, and so only these reproduce and the rest don't. There you would have evolution occurring. So some examples of natural selection which we find most famously is the peppered moths. So what happens is when the environment changes, natural selection will favor different traits in a species. So if an environment changes, then the variation within a population will change. So the peppered moth is a scientific name, Byston betullaria, and it comes in a range of shades from very, very light to very, very dark. And the body color is from a single gene. And black individuals have the dominant allele, which was very rare until the 1850s. But after that, it became more and more frequent to increase to almost 100% of the population was black. Okay, the reason for that was of industrialization. So all the coal being burnt to fuel the Industrial Revolution was spewed from these power plants or whatever, and it covered the trees, and so now the trees were no longer white, they were now darker in color, and so they were more easily eaten and identified by predators, and so there was a selection event there. So this meets all 3 of our criteria. We have variation within a trait, the color of a moth. We have selection occurring by a predation of birds, and one being favored over the other, in this case dark moths over light moths. And then that trait, which is a dominant trait, can then be passed on from one generation to the other. So this is called industrial melanism. Melanism would be the increase of melanin, which is the pigment which makes moths darker. Eventually, pollution control resulted in the trees returning to their normal light color. And so then the percentage of melanistic or darker moths decreased and returned back to the lighter population as well. So here's an example of a selection event occurring, causing a change in the population of a trait. All right, so now we're going to go through some other evidences of evolution via natural selection. The first being artificial selection. So this demonstrates that there is variation within populations, enough to create all sorts of different things that aren't there naturally. Artificial selection is change initiated by humans, where they may select a certain trait and then breed that trait. And it's very evident in, for example, pigeons. All these different varieties of pigeons are from the same species, but you can select them for different colors and shapes and sizes and everything else. This is a directional selection, right? Let's say you want to select for really large heads, so you would get a bunch of pigeons. You would select the ones with larger heads and mate those, and then from their progeny you would select the larger headed pigeons and mate those until you get a really large head. Oops. Okay. Scientists concur that this is because of an evolutionary process that we are allowed to do that. You have lots of variation within these. However, critics of evolution say, well, yes, it occurs, but not enough to account for the changes in the fossil record. But they fail to take into account the amount of variation produced by artificial selection. So if you were to find all these fossils of these dogs, you would conclude probably just by that evidence that they are different species. But they're not. All species of dog are derived from wolves. One species of wolf. So all species of dog are from the same species and are actually wolves. But there's a lot of variation within the wolf population that you can select for. Domestication is another example of artificial selection where we're selecting for friendly progeny, right? And some of them were also selected for other things, like Dachshunds were selected for badger pursuit. So another common example of this is there's actually a group of scientists in Russia that domesticated foxes. And what they found over the past 40 years while selecting for more docile individuals was that they had some of the same traits that domesticated dogs have, including big, floppier ears, a bushy tail that is generally lower, and of course friendliness to humans. So this may be because of some linkage between those genes, between domestication or being docile and floppy ears and friendly faces or whatever. Or it may be pleiotropy or some other genetic combination in work. All right, another example of artificial selection has been done in the lab and reproduced multiple times, is selecting fruit flies for different traits. So in this example, the amount of hairs on the abdomen were selected for. The average number was 9.5, but by selecting again for the greatest or individuals that have more and more of these bristles, they were able to create, or through selection, create a population that has a population of 40. Okay, so again, just by selecting, you can make changes in traits. We do this as well in our agricultural selection. So the progenitor of corn did not have as many kernels as we have now. Tons and tons of kernels on corn, but this doesn't look like anything in the wild because we've selected for individuals that had more and more of these kernels to create this giant cob with lots of kernels on it. Same thing happens for milk production or wheat production, or various other agricultural products are all selected for by humans. All right, those are all kind of the same thing, artificial selection. But there's more. So we have fossil evidence of evolution. Fossils are the preserved remains of once living organisms. Generally, it has bone tissue, which has been replaced with minerals, which gives us an outline of what the bones looked like. Age of fossils can be estimated by isotope analysis. And this has shown that species have been changing for billions of years. And you can also trace the change from some species by looking at the different fossil records. An example of this is Archaeopteryx. So missing links are commonly referred to that, we don't have transitionary species. But the more and more fossils we find, the more and more transitionary links we find between one species and another. The greatest example of this has been Archaeopteryx, or I guess most famous. So Archaeopteryx was a dinosaur fossil found, which shows to have both bird and dinosaur-like characteristics, showing it as an intermediary between dinosaurs and birds. So birds evolved from dinosaurs is the conclusion made. So it has some ancestral characteristics like this really long tail. Birds don't have tails. It has teeth. Birds don't have teeth. And some and some bird characteristics, like it has a beak. It has feathers. You can see those fossilized as well. So this is great evidence for the evolution of birds from dinosaur ancestors. Other examples of fossil records which have lots of evolutionary transitions or missing links are whale evolution. You can trace that through a number of different species which have similar skull characteristics but different appendage characteristics. You have a fossil snake with legs. You have Tiktaalik, which is a species that represents modern terrestrial vertebrates, so the gap between fish and the first amphibian. Oysters have small curved shells to large flat shells within the fossil record. So again, there's lots of fossil record examples of these transitionary species. Another example is horse evolution. So modern horses are interesting because they only have one digit, the middle finger, and that is what makes up their hoof, and very specialized teeth. Well, if you look back in the fossil record, you can trace all the way back to the first transitionary fossil, which has 4 digits, and one of them which is larger, and then some teeth with some specialization on them. Again, look through the fossil record and you can see the reduction in the number of digits and the complexity of the teeth. And this occurred with climate change. As grasslands became more widespread, the evolution of the teeth also occurred to allow for more efficient eating of grass. All right, so another anatomical evidence for evolution is homologous structures. Okay, these are structures with different appearances and functions, but are derived from the same part in a common ancestor. So an example of this are the radius and the ulna in different mammals. They are found in humans, cats, bats, porpoise, horse, each with a different function, but you can still see that they're positioned in the same place and they are the same bones, and they're shared among all mammals. You can also see similar structures in the development embryonically and throughout development from hatchling or neonate or baby to adult in different species as well. Embryos from different vertebrates often have the same structures early on, so you can't really tell the difference between a horse, bat, or human in its early embryonic stages. In fact, in humans, you have glands in ducks developing from the same structures which form gill slits in fish. Another thing is imperfections, right? So if this is more of an argument against something being designed, because if it was designed, then it would probably be designed the same for, or be designed perfectly. And that's how evolution works. It is not going to design or is not going to evolve into perfect structures, but rather structures that work, whether they work perfectly or not. So an example of that is vertebrae in giraffe necks. They have the same number of vertebrae as humans, 7 in their neck, and it functions, right? You may think that, having multiple vertebrae or more vertebrae would help to have a more flexible neck, or you could probably design a stretchier neck or whatever the case, but because it works that's what they have. Another example is in the eyes of vertebrates versus the eye of mollusks, the arrangement of photoreceptors and nerves are different, so that we have a blind spot because our nerves cover our photoreceptors. Whereas in mollusks, they don't have that problem because they're different arrangement, and so they don't have a blind spot. Well, it doesn't really matter if we have a blind spot because it works good enough, right? Evolution. But if you were designing something, you probably wouldn't design it with that blind spot. I think this is one of the strongest evidences of evolution, is having vestigial structures, which are structures found within skeletons or other anatomical physiological functions of organisms, but do not have any function. So, for example, human ear wiggling muscles. Why do we need to wiggle our ears? We don't, but we have the muscles, and some people can even do it, can even move their ears. But ancestrally, humans probably had an ancestor that needed to move its ears around, and so those muscles are still there. There's also hip bones and boa constrictors, but they, snakes that don't have legs. Similarly, whales have leg bones, even though they don't have legs. They're just embedded in the fat. They don't actually touch any other bones and are just hanging out there. The tailbone is also has little to no function in humans, as does the appendix. So these are relics of evolution of an ancestor which once maybe had a function for them. All right, biogeography is a study of the geographic distribution of species. And what's interesting is if you have a similar climate in different geographical areas, they will produce many of the same types of species, even though they are not related at all. So natural selection appears to, in these different environments, if it's the same selection pressure, provide for the same characteristics. So these are cacti in South Africa, in a desert there, similar to the cacti found in southwestern United States. All right, convergent evolution is also apparent through biogeography, where you have similar forms from non-related species because of the similar environments. So an example of this is marsupials and placental mammals. Marsupials are found on Australia, and no mammals, well, originally were found on there. And you can find the similar niches or similar types of organisms that are marsupials as you find in mammalian areas as well. So there's a marsupial flying squirrel and there's a mammalian flying squirrel. In addition, another example would be the streamlined efficiency created by the environment in the ocean or in large bodies of water. These are unrelated organisms: a dinosaur, a mammal, a fish, and a shark. These are probably the most closely related. They all have the same aerodynamic shape, which is ideal for swimming in the ocean. Finally, if you look at islands and the organisms that live on there, which is also what Darwin saw with these finches, there's a lot of missing plants and animals that are common on continents, but if you move them to those islands, they will live there and can often thrive there. So the common thinking is that these species on islands diverged from continental relatives. An example of that is the gray fox and the island foxes found in the Catalina Islands in California. These island foxes are much smaller, but otherwise look very similar. So Darwin concluded many islands have never been connected to the mainland. Those species arrived on islands through dispersing, and once they were on there, they radiated into all different types of species based on the different selection pressures of that island. But the species that can fly, float, or swim are more likely to inhabit islands, such as bats or birds or other animals that can swim. All right. So finally, we're going to go over the criticisms of Darwin's theory. And again, evolution is nearly universally accepted by biologists. There is some source of controversy in the general public, which has led to some controversial policies as well. The 7 principal objections. First is that it is not solidly demonstrated, and that it's just a theory. Well, the theory of, like we've talked about before, a theory means more than just a guess or an idea that you have. A theory in science is something that has been tested over and over and over, and there's lots of evidence for. So it actually is solidly demonstrated in the scientific record. There are no fossil intermediates. We showed before there are actually lots of intermediates which have been found since Darwin's time. So originally, this is one of the criticisms of Darwin when he first hypothesized the theory. But we found lots of missing links since then. There's the intelligent design argument, which is that many structures are too complex for a random process. Well, natural selection is not random, right? There is actually a constant set of parameters set in the desert, for example, and it's the same. It's not random, and thus it's not necessarily a random event, although it is not directed, right? The evolution does not have a goal. Evolution violates the second law of thermodynamics, which is that entropy must increase, or everything must be more disorganized. Well, Earth is not a closed system. We have tons of energy input coming from the sun constantly, and so with that energy input, you have the opportunity to organize around that energy. Proteins are too improbable, so the probability of hemoglobin as a random event is 1 to the 20th to the 141st power. Well, that's kind of backwards thinking, because it's already there, so you can't say the probability of existing is nothing, especially when you don't know the probabilities of any event, because the universe is so big, right? So you could similarly say the probability of having the birth dates of the students in this class is nearly impossible. Yet here we are, and they're all the same. So that would be like arguing backwards as well. All right, natural selection does not imply evolution. No scientist has evolved a fish into a frog, right? We can't experimentally take one species and go from another, is the argument. But artificial selection has produced a lot of very distinctive individuals or subspecies from one species in the wild. For example, here is a cattle breed which has been bred to have lots and lots of muscle. Okay, it doesn't look anything like cattle in the wild. The irreducible complexity argument, which is similar to one we had before, but basically things are too complex. Evolution cannot come from such simple means to such complex means. But when you do take things apart, you actually find natural selection acts on a complex system because it has multiple stages, right? So the eyeball is one example. You can find many different complexities of light sensing organs, which range from pigmented cells to a very complex eye, and everything in between. So it's not like it came out of nowhere. There are different stages in which it could have evolved from. Finally, these are my own thoughts. The question then remains, is evolution a proven fact? Can you say, oh, well, it's been proven? And I don't like that terminology. No, we don't necessarily prove things in science, but it is the best explanation for the evidence given. And any alternate theories are either not testable by science or not supported by the evidence. And a viable alternative theory would have to encompass all of the evidence for evolution with a different explanation. So there hasn't been anything which has come along which has been better able to explain the evidence given. So evolution is the best theory for the evidence. And I think that's the best way to talk about it, and is also, I think, the most non-offensive. On the other end, people often will ask, do you believe in evolution? And I don't like that question either, because it implies an element of faith or belief. In science, you don't need to believe things. You can have a hypothesis. Whether or not you believe in that hypothesis is pretty much irrelevant. You must go through the rigors of testing it through scientific experiments. And if the data support it, then it supports it. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. But the element of faith is not really necessary in science. So, and this is where the conflict comes, because in religion, you're talking about belief, faith, and spirituality. In science, you're really just compiling evidence for or against. And so I don't like this question, because evolution is scientific. Belief is more of a spiritual, faith-promoted thing. And those are the nuts and bolts of it. I could go into this and have a whole another lecture about that. But in that sense, it is okay to accept evolution as the best theory, and to believe in a higher order or being. And I'll let you fill in the gaps, and maybe we can have a discussion in class about that. All right.